style. I have been rewarded by women's often unique and empowered choices when facing challenges to their initial birthing plans. Rewarded by the confirmation of true actualized empowerment. Women, as well as peers, have projected upon me a belief that I have a formal hierarchical appraisal of birth that is influenced by location or indeed the type of birth. Whereas I will agree that some uniqueness of a home as a context for birth can make a birth more memorable for its unique surrounds, it in no way changes the satisfaction and joy that can be experienced from the inevitable immersion into the client's goals, preferences and experience. It frustrates me, beyond my abilities of expression, to say how angry I feel that women are subject to pressures to comply with other people's value structures. In my experience, midwives contribute to this either consciously or subconsciously, but immensely. Midwives are rightfully and expressively very proud of their With Women moniker, and often celebrate that their actions are in defence of the empowerment of women to exercise their rights for birthing options. However, there has been a fostered hypocrisy in relation to the realisation of women's collective empowerment to birth and receive care in their individual, chosen fashion. For example, a midwife may cast aspersions as to a woman's choice to have an elective caesarean without a medical reason, to choose an epidural rather than to have a drug-free birthing experience, or a choice to feed their baby with artificial milk instead of breastfeeding. I have witnessed women in preferred models of care, be it caseload midwifery programs or birth centre cares, that have been discarded at the birthroom door or theatre by their respective named carers for sometimes little more than a change in analgesic preference or the genesis of anything other than a normal, uncomplicated birth. This transition and upheaval arguably dictates more individualised, personalised reflective care from a known care provider, but instead is compounded by midwifery withdrawal. A punishment, intended or not, because of closed mind philosophies. Excuses such as no longer low risk care or exceeding scope, etc., are not justified, but are often given. As a midwife, for as long as I can remember, commenced all introductions by stating that I have a bias towards natural birth. That comes from my exposure to home birth, caseload midwifery, my experience and personal preferences, as well as my understanding of evaluated peer-reviewed care options. But I go on to say that this is a bias which I declare and am aware of, and that I'm making you aware so as you can temper my answers, given as objectively as I can, with awareness of the perspective I may be reflecting. I also ensure that they are aware that their choices will ultimately be my guide to their care, and as such will be respected and acted upon free from any judgment. Following the initial challenges experienced on both sides by bringing this essential declaration to the open, it quickly fades, almost inconsequential, as you expand your relationship by exploring choices, wishes, hopes and fears together, free from preconceptions and judgments of any kind. One such empowered woman was Joanna, a woman who had planned for a drug-free, active celebration of her abilities after being initially challenged with difficulties falling pregnant, and was faced with having to have a caesarean section because of a placental location. Following the initial bleaching of her hopes in a tsunamic realization of loss and control and choices, she had a secondary option to regain her power. She would plan. She would make a caesarean birth plan. What could she control? What options were there? After all, the sterile, purposeful theatre was anything but a display of improvised, fertile fruition. The green surgical drapes overlaid the crimson red of her staged performance. The spotlight was centre stage, and the audience for the execution was strangers in an anonymous pyjama party. To take control was to meddle in the well-rehearsed, scripted formula. Luhrmann's bard in mind, revolution could be sweet, and the exit music of that performance could herald an emancipation from tradition and a swing to her own empowerment. She planned, and her choices opened, and this was the birth of her ideas. Her pupils and that of those involved dilated at the emergence of these possibilities. The anaesthetist would not be the unknown stranger, but would be the musical director and head of photography. His repertoire, although ultimately intoxicating, would provide clarity and a signature on the whole collective's performance. His assistants would support in providing interpretation and subtitles as required. The main character players, the obstetrician and registrar, were both familiar to Joanna, the principals but professional enough to recognise talent and knowledgeable enough to not upstage Joanna in her starring role. Their well-learned roles would be faithfully executed with minimal need for ad-lib or deviation. Of course, their skills ensured that this performance unfolded there would be no surprises, and if any deviation did arise, then contingencies could be undertaken to safeguard the performance itself. The set design was essential for the atmosphere and the immersion into the performance. Peripheral and unnecessary lighting was to be omitted to provide a pure point of focus and minimise interruption and distraction. The paediatrician and neonatal nurse would function as supporting roles to the guest stars, an emerging individual with a bright future. If, however, his or her talents needed their experience for any reason, they would be there. Of course, his or her performance was pivotal in the inevitable appraisal of the whole performance. For my part, I was the personal and at times general assistant, as well as a fan base for the whole event. So Joanna met with her anaesthetist and her team. The music to be played throughout the surgery was of her choosing. She met a senior theatre coordinating nurse and discussed her preferences, and after some discussion and exploration of essential elements of procedure and logistics, a plan was arranged to reduce peripheral lighting, have a minimum background noise and dialogue of theatre staff, while still ensuring all safety aspects were to be met. The paediatric department also facilitated their wealth of appreciation for a baby's options and benefits of expedient maternal-paternal interaction. The framework for these discussions and considerations had already been scaffolded for by the interactions between myself, the consultant and teams, as well as the respective theatre, anaesthetic departments and paediatric department. The previously almost unheard of caesarean birth plan had been created, and a powerful woman proved secondary fertile in her genesis of motherhood. On the day of her caesarean, Joanna didn't at first live up to the heroine I had witnessed grow through this experience. She was nervous, fearful, uncertain, as only a person standing on the precipice of life-changing events can feel. As her personal assistant, I reflected on my awe of her as a woman, motivated, courageous and beautiful. Her partner Greg held her shoulders and pressed his face into hers and said words of loving encouragement, reinforcement and belief. The spell was done. She transformed from her fearful, vulnerable cocoon to the accomplished, free and strong mother she already was. Her drug supplier and DJ for the day perfectly timed in with the celebration of his role and broke the intensity into a matter-of-fact preamble into the main event. His words, consciously or otherwise, were essential at moving us forward. The music was primed, the camera was familiar after a full rundown courtesy of Greg into its nuances and workings. It was an impressive specimen of photographic technological achievement, and I remember thinking to myself how lucky I was not to have the pressure of securing precious images of such an important occasion. The background chatter was a hush, something akin to the formation of the congregation of a church event. There were inevitable curious onlookers, not bemused by outside skeptics, which played no part in the event. There was no separation of Joanna and Greg for the insertion of the spinal, but there were for the theatre preparations, as Joanna was brought into the theatre itself from the anaesthetic prep room. This was a logistical acquiescence of sterility, and maintaining the operative field could not be compromised, and was for a short duration only. The flourishing application of drapes was accompanied by applications of saturation monitors, blood pressure cuffs, replacement IV bags hung like jewellery from the stand, and the essential urethral catheterization took place with a simple informative introduction and little regard from Joanna. The theatre, in its unfamiliar subdued tone, seemed even more efficient and busy in some way. Acknowledgements of well-being between Joanna and Greg for myself were secured by eye gestures, smiles, and acknowledging expressions that were drawn from a familiar repertoire. As the preparations moved closer to the operation itself, more drapes and more players entered into the environment. The consultant and registrar demonstrated their inclusion by reintroducing themselves before they commenced the substantiating discussion and announced the commencement of the procedure with a hush. A squeeze of Joanna's hand, a touch of Greg's shoulder, heralded my withdrawal and employment of liaising with the newly arrived paediatric team. Checks were done in the corner on the resuscitator in case it was needed by the baby. The music started with the calm narration from the obstetrician. The theatre had an aura of a fortune teller's mystical backroom. The changes had given a venerable sanctity to the proceedings, a metaphysical stage for the events to unfold. The surgical light, spherical illuminance, focusing the attention to the future arrival. The hush whispered instructions, gestures, occasionally broken by subdued metal clanks of punctuation to the proceedings, and irreverent suction sounds as posture and movement heralded arrival. This was a birth. This was an everyday miracle, not lessened by assistance but enriched by a comprehensive supportive cast, the wise men gathering, the illumination guiding them from the holy place of realization, the shepherded toils of the supportive viewers. A flurry of activity from the anaesthetic team pronounced an awareness of timing to the baby's greeting, which was underlined by the "say hello to your baby" now being expressed from the obstetrician. As the baby emerged from the visceral crimson cauldron to the green drape that was pegged obscuring her view, was freed from its tether to allow reaching hands to touch her baby, the cries of which reassured and facilitated sighs of approval from the transfixed onlookers. The cord was long and, as per instruction, was unadulterated and unclamped, but hindered full progression to maternal embrace. The tactile contact to her child had caused Joanna to uncontrollably sob. Her head fell back in sheer expression of delightful release, an orgasmic realization of accomplishment and relief. The obstetrician cut the cord with some clever ninja dexterity that did not intrude. Contact with Mum's hands dictated a glove change which dutifully occurred as he proceeded to the assessment and conclusion of his tasks. Tasks which would continue without Joanna or Greg's perception or observation. The green screen had been reattached, but the couple's attentions were elsewhere. As Joanna stirred from her inner self, she drew her baby to her, fingers, eyes searching for recognition, identification, introduction, and assertion. Her eyes welled again, the focus from baby to Greg, who was, by now, crumple-chinned and holding back a torrent of joyous and releasing tears. His tears began to flow, as he leant forward to simultaneously kiss Joanna and touch the baby. "We did it," she sobbed, and as she did, Greg's damn wall broke, and he sobbed, "Yes, we did, my love." These were not secluded oases of emotion. Sniffs and sighs of restraint were audible from all around the dark-veiled theatre. A veil under the influence of a request to remain quietened, but a veil that broke all the rules as it broke into spontaneous and unheard-of applause. A purity of humanistic celebration, a celebration of accomplishment, that caused laughter to break the sobs, laughter that shone like the sun breaking through the cloud. One person in sympathetic disquiet asked, "Well, is it a boy or a girl?" Joanna and Greg had asked not to be informed of the gender antenatally, and their discovery was still to be realised. "Oh, I don't know," Joanna expressed as she glanced at Greg, and then myself. I shrugged my shoulders and facially gestured any lack of insight. Joanna searched and declared, "Oh, it's a girl!" A girl that was being congratulated by many voices from the theatre team. The couple then enjoyed a period of time with their daughter, observations of which continued unobtrusively from myself. The paediatric components of our team excused themselves without disturbing the new family. The neonatal nurse whispering, "That was beautiful," in my ear as they took their leave. When the baby made gestures to feed, it prompted Joanna to seek advice and support. She already was well on the way to facilitate this need for her daughter when I assisted with a few logistical alterations, assistance only required because of the compromised position that the caesarean had dictated. Joanna, Greg and Elizabeth travelled through from the conclusion of their birthing experience with a chain of verbal congratulations. As the operational part ended, they warmly thanked the consultant and the registrar, both of which made their enjoyment of the birth known to them. As the theatre curtain closed and the lights were essentially brought up to herald their departure, the couple thanked everyone, and they were in turn thanked from being allowed to be a part of their birth. With Elizabeth sucking, they left theatre and moved through recovery, uneventfully. Feeding, undisturbed, the baby in her arms with minimal intrusion except for checks of loss and blood pressures, was quiet but reassuringly well, and so it continued until the family took their rest on the postnatal ward. A beautiful experience, an empowered birth, theatre birth, but a birth that was celebrated by many people's hearts.